Hello, and welcome back to ThoughtBat. Some of you may know that I recently participated in a debate with fellow traveller on market versus planned economies on President Sunday's channel. If you have not watched the debate, I highly recommend you do so before watching this video. The link is in the description. Not to blow on my own trumpet, but I can gladly say that the debate was a good discussion between two people of very different political backgrounds and a positive example of how leftist discourse should be conducted. However, in this debate I eventually conceded defeat, not because I was convinced by my opponent, but because on the night I was far too indecisive about my approach, and so lessons have been learned with regards to planning and preparation for debates. More importantly, I feel I failed to control the narrative as well. Fellow traveller asked some incredibly important questions about my politics, and I didn't get round to answering them. So that's what this video is for. I understand that fellow traveller isn't here to respond to my arguments, but I will do what I can to make sure he is aware that it exists. And I look forward to any criticism he may have for me. My opening statement was focused on my ethical defence of usufruct property rights, and how this starting point leads to a primarily market socialist economy coexisting within a diverse range of accompanying models for resource distribution based on such property norms and voluntary association, making full use of the freedom to experiment and compete to solve socio-economic problems. My objection to a centrally planned economy was out of concern for the negation of usufruct property rights and workplace autonomy. Fellow traveller argued in favour of a steady-state cybernetic planned economy and focused his arguments around the capability of such a model to organise production according to human need, maximise efficiency, facilitate individual freedom, and maintain a balanced load with our habitat. His concern with cooperative enterprise was with regard to cooperatives operating to serve market demands. At the end of Traveller's statement, he asked me a series of questions, some of which were more about anarchism than they were about market socialist economies, but all of which were important questions nonetheless. And I'd add that the number of questions asked in one go did make it difficult for me to even remember the questions being asked.
From what I understand, you are an anarchist, but without a state, how do you keep industrial cooperatives from dumping toxic lead into a water supply in order to save money? How do you hope to circumvent the economic turbulence associated with the market economy? How do you expect to sustain full employment when people's labor prospects are left up to whether or not their cooperatives can compete and turn a profit? If outsourcing and interest are as business practices are prohibited without a state, how do you keep the larger cooperatives from engaging in such exploitative practices? Will everyone in the syndicates and communes simply be expected to adhere to some sort of code of conduct? How do you enforce such a thing? What if a neighboring commune decides to sell off their industry to private owners for a fast buck and they start operating identical to traditional private firms?
So a lot of good questions in such a small amount of time. Anyways, in this video, I'm going to go through them one by one. 1. Without a state, how could you keep a cooperative from dumping toxic lead into a water supply in order to save money? So, as we are all dependent on the environment and are affected by ecological destruction, it is reasonable that an anarchist society would maintain a range of environmental protections. You can't go around exterminating pollinators or poisoning water supplies for very obvious reasons. Protections against a particular occurrence could be maintained via the means of common ownership. As the water supply is indeed used by the rest of the community, it is not contradictory to my standard of use-based property rights to have so-called natural monopolies, roads, nature reserves, etc. brought into common ownership or communal ownership and be maintained via voluntary funding and representative agencies. Alternatively, the water supply itself could be cooperatively owned by the workers, who purify it, bottle it and take it to market or pipeline it. In the latter instance, it may be necessary for the cooperative to be a consumer-owned co-op than a worker one. The violation of this common or co-op property would be taken to the judiciary system in place within the given area to hold the perpetrators to justice. 2. How do you circumvent the economic turbulence associated with the market economy? Worker cooperatives in modern-day capitalist economies are shown to be much more resilient to economic turbulence and price shocks than capitalist firms. Cooperatives have been known to cut pay during recessions to prevent colleagues from losing their jobs, for example. This has been demonstrated again during the COVID pandemic, as cooperatives were only a quarter as likely to dissolve during the economic turmoil as their capitalist counterparts. UK cooperative CEO Rose Marley explains that for cooperative purpose, ownership and governance all dictate long-termism. In an economic shock, it's the members calling the shots in their collective, not investors making decisions based on short-term returns. Co-ops patiently build up and reinvest reserves and use members' capital wherever possible, rather than piling up debt in order to achieve faster growth. End quote. During the pandemic, co-ops across the UK have enjoyed a 2.8% increase in total revenue, which is money being used to meet the needs of its members and their communities and not being siphoned off into the back pocket of some capitalist parasite. In extreme cases, an anarchist society can radically transform into a more of a collectivized or communized setup to ensure people's basic needs are met, as they are not rigidly controlled by constitutional governments designed to protect the interests of the powerful. Members of co-ops living in these communities will have incentive to do what's necessary to protect themselves, their friends, their families and neighbours, etc. 3. How do you expect to sustain full employment when people's labour prospects are left up to whether or not their cooperatives can compete and turn a profit? First, I should say that full employment is not necessarily a goal of an anarchist economy, because cooperatives themselves benefit from a pool of unemployment in order to have a labour market of workers who want to work in a cooperative. Additionally, an anarchist society will be able to break down or circumvent barriers to learning a skill or trade through liberating education systems from its absurd reservation of young people and children, removing arbitrary licensing requirements, etc. Mutual aid networking can also mitigate some of the negative effects of unemployment, and the abolition of absentee land ownership will ensure that everyone has a home. 4. If outsourcing and interest are prohibited, without a state, how would you keep the larger cooperatives from engaging in such exploitative practices? This is actually a common misconception of libertarian socialism and anarchism. We don't seek to prohibit absentee property rights, rent payments, interest, etc. Anarchists hold that the state enforcement is required for these concepts to even exist, let alone function properly. We actually wish not to enforce them, as there will not be legally binding agreements anymore. Knowing that no one in the community will be around to enforce your absentee property rights, no one will invest in them. Even if it was agreed between both parties via contract or title deed, they will not be recognised by any legal authority. If today I agreed to sell myself to another person, since slavery has already been abolished, I would no longer be under any obligation to hold my end of the bargain. If the other person was to enforce such a thing themselves, they'd be the ones committing the crime. But I suppose this is a question of how law and order will be maintained in an anarchist society, and we talked about this briefly in the debate. I recommend you read Anarchy and Legal Order by Gary Chartier. Skip past the parts in ethics which justify a legal system. I disagree with the exact ethical standards anyway, and get to the part on particular models of law enforcement. The bottom line is that we're advocating a polycentric judicial system involving both territorial and non-territorial legal regimes operating in different places and spaces where appropriate. 5. What if a neighbouring commune was to sell off their industry to private owners for a fast buck and they start operating identical to traditional private firms? Effectively, the question is asking, what if people aren't anarchists anymore? Well, we no longer have anarchism in that case. It's a problem for every ideology to prove to the people living under it that it serves their interests. But I would welcome any private owner to come to an anarchist society and convince them to give up their freedom to work under a private dictatorship. As Max Stirner reminds us, so long as the workers are conscious of the lack of necessity of an external owner for them to enjoy their labour's product, capitalism and the state are lost. I could ask a counter question to Traveller. What if government planners decide that it would be better to reintroduce the enforcement of private property rights, as we have seen in the People's Republic of China? In fact, what if the government decides to rigidly enforce any irrational policy? This could extend beyond economics too, as the Soviet Union recriminalized homosexuality and abortion as extreme forms of population management, which itself is fundamental to economic planning. We still see this today with China's social credit system. It seems to me that the belief that a specific rational plan is needed to keep the economy functional means that the vanguardist nature of the Workers' Party will decide it needs to defend the policy by all means necessary through directly controlling the media, outlawing opposition movements and dissident unions, and overruling workplace democracy to degenerate into a form of state capitalism. This seems to be not a cancer of Marxist-Leninist states, but a feature of them, all to ensure everything goes to plan. Near the start of the debate, fellow Traveller argued that he prefers not to argue for socialism in terms of ethics, as there are more convincing ways to sell socialism to workers by appealing to their material interests.
I want to say something about his opening statements. When he talks about arguing for his system from a ethical standpoint, the reason why I generally try to stay away from arguing in favor of socialism from a moral or ethics standpoint is because I feel like there are more convincing ways to sell people on it, and I think a better way to do it would be to appeal to people's material interests, showcase the pragmatic how it's a pragmatic solution, how it's more efficient. Because think about it, people are in favor of the current system because they think it's the best and only way to organize our economy. And you can try to convince them through morals, but the only people that are really going to be convinced by that are people that are already sympathetic to you. It's better to showcase how your system is better, how it's more efficient, and why it could offer them a better way of life.
Now, this argument is more to do with strategy and outreach, and I agree with it. But it doesn't address the importance of ethics when socialists themselves are deciding which policies or models they advocate, or which principles they are to base a policy on, as that was what this debate is focused on. As Albert Camus argued in his book, The Rebel, we'd be walking contradictions if we were to be ethical nihilists and also rebels, because we need to operate based on a moral framework which judges the status quo to be illegitimate. It should be noted that fellow traveller didn't actually say he didn't care about ethics, but I just feel like we didn't talk enough about ethics. As I explained in the debate, I'm an egoist, and so my ethics do revolve around my self-interest, and my politics around facilitating mutual self-interest. Anarchism follows from my ethical positions, as I do not believe any individual is obligated to respect or serve any authority other than themselves. If a group of people's interests were neglected for the sake of abstractions, such as efficiency or the greater good, then they have no material interest in being obedient and instead decide to work independently for themselves. While I think I made an effective defence of worker cooperatives, fellow traveller brought up the capitalistic activities of Mondragon.
I'm glad he brought out Mondragon because Mondragon outsources about a third of their labor force, and I mean, you can look this up on Wikipedia, but roughly a third of their labor force isn't even officially a part of the company. They're outsourced to second and third world countries, and of course, subsidiary countries that he mentioned, and they only receive like a fraction of the wages and benefits. So yeah, there's no direct exploitation between wage labor and capital, but within such a context, you would still be able to exploit the members of the smaller, lower co-ops, because fundamentally the profit motive is still at the heart of all of this, and there's still a direct material incentive to engage in these behaviors in the first place. And that when we look at the real world, it's not really ethics that drives human behavior, but really their own material interests.
But these activities are only enabled by the fact they live in a capitalist system, which facilitates and rewards capitalism. As explained earlier in the debate and also in this video, an anarchist society will not enforce the intellectual tools necessary for cooperatives like Mondragon to engage in such activities. Further, Mondragon does not consist of people who are committed to mutualism, anarchism, or any kind of socialism for that matter. They're factory workers who like the idea of voting for their boss. Similarly to the unions, cooperatives can only be as radical as the working class. I'm sure fellow traveller would agree, ideological commitment to socialism can only come from either anarchist federations or communist parties. On the point about democracy, fellow traveller justify the centralisation of the state through saying democracy is the imposition of the majority onto the minority. But I question whether this is really the case. I asked if democracy is just a case of voting. Fellow traveller said it was the rule of the people and explained how it may function in his preferred model of a state.
It's not really worker autonomy then, is it? It's state autonomy.
Well, the state from the top to bottom is nothing but workers or elected administrators and representatives from bodies of workers. So it's a proletarian democracy, basically.
But if you've got a country the size of the United States, so that's roughly 300 million people, 150, is it 150 million voting people who would vote normally? I don't know what the stats are on that.
Roughly.
So when I say before, the more people you have in a centralized democracy, the less of an impact your vote has. Effectively, if you go into a situation, so if you go into a country where the thing's mainly run by the state, okay, it's a quote unquote worker state, but you've got 1/50 millionth of a say and how the things run.
Well, you've cracked the code. That's the whole point of a democracy. It's the majority imposing its will on the minority. Now, I do think there should be legal protections for like minorities, but the goal should be to realize the most satisfying outcome for as many people as possible. But yeah, I mean, that's the general idea of a democracy.
Well, not entirely, because if we see, what is democracy just voting?
I mean, it's more than just voting. I mean, it's,
What is it then?
well, democracy means rule of the people, or like the governance of the people by the people, like demokrates. It's an old Greek word. And that's the reason why I think wherever direct voting initiatives should be available, they should be. At the same time, people should have equal economic rights as well as equal political rights. And I feel like if you have a system that directly and rationally plans for such a context and has that taken into account, you could definitely achieve this.
But rule by the people doesn't necessarily need to be centralised. In fact, I'd argue it's less democratic to have the individual's impact on politics that affect them to be minimised to one over the population of the country. Through radical decentralisation and the facilitation of voluntary association, individuals can have a greater impact on the issues that directly affect their lives. With the breathtaking diversity of models for organisation, they can leave organisations and join new ones if it better serves their interest. Bringing economic power directly back down to the people is surely more democratic than forcibly neglecting the interests of tens of millions, or in some cases hundreds of millions of people for the sake of centralisation. Towards the later stages of the debate, we talked about the meaning of the state.
Would you say that having a state that makes murder illegal, even though, because it does restrict on people's quote unquote freedoms? I know you don't consider the freedom to murder a freedom, and I would agree with you, but the idea is that if the state is enforcing laws which impose certain personal restrictions in order to realize the best outcomes for everyone, to enforce the rule that nobody can murder anyone, I mean, would you say that's a preferable outcome than not having a state which does that?
I don't think you need a state to do that, but I would say that is a preferable outcome to a failed state whereby there is no replacement judicial system.
Yeah, gotcha. So there's an equivocation between the anarchist and Marxist definition of a state. Go ahead and define a state for me. Just what's a state? Just make this engaging.
Organization holding a monopoly on force.
All right, cool. Well, as we Marxist-Leninists come to understand it, is the state exists as a tool to facilitate or impose the law of the ruling class. It's a tool of class domination, basically. It's the reason why, it's the reason why cops response time of police is substantially faster in rich neighborhoods with property related crimes than it is in poor neighborhoods with violent related crimes. So the state exists to accommodate the needs of whatever hell economic system is placed, and basically ensure the rule of the ruling class. I'd say that's the main difference. So
it's if it's a specific tool, well, I don't like the word tool because that could mean a range of things, couldn't it? I mean, I'd say then an anarchist society would itself be a state as long as you've got some kind of judicial system. As long as you've got some kind of judicial system regulating some kind of maintaining certain laws of man, then that would be a state in Lenin's definition.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah. Anarchists, in a sense, are in favor of a kind of state. It's just, it's more. You guys are in favor of more like a federated system than you are like a central government, from what I understand.
I think there's a range of models for how rights can be protected. Some people advocate a polycentric legal order, where it's deterritorialized and you do it through syndicates, on virtual syndicates. Some people will say no, it will be territorialized, but it just needs to be incredibly democratic and incredibly small. There's a range of models. I've not exactly sold on either or, but again, when we're talking about a free society, I imagine there'll be a range of models implemented in different parts of different territories, depending on what people are most convinced by and what people find works and where.
Is that it?
After reading Lenin's The State and Revolution, I understand that Lenin defined the state as a tool or mechanism for one class to pin down another within a given territory. But defining the state this way misses the point of the anarchist critique. We define the state as an organisation holding a monopoly on force over a given territory. Lenin's definition would include currently existing and past anarchist societies as statist, and the hypothetical bureaucracy using the most brutal uses of force imaginable over a classless population, a stateless society. When the majority of people talk about the state, we do not refer to one specific thing the organisation does, rather what it necessarily holds, and it is clear that the monopoly in force is the definitive feature. Fellow traveller also brought up Yugoslavia, but that's a topic that, I need to look more into, as it requires a video of its own to talk about. Although I promised Hakeem the same thing several months ago, I will get round to it. To conclude, I think Fellow Traveller debated very well on the night, and is clearly knowledgeable on the subject, so if you're interested in learning more about Marxist-Leninism, you should definitely check out his channel. Same goes for President Sunday, who is working on developing a platform for small yet serious content creators like myself to share our ideas away from the circuses and drama theatres of mainstream breadtube. Incredibly valuable work in my opinion. I'll link both their channels into the description below. In the meantime, I hope you found this video informative. If you did, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Also, you can follow me on Twitter, and you can join the Batcave, which is my Discord server where I regularly discuss my views in an informal manner with viewers. Links are also in the description below. I will now leave you with a message from the one and only Vidya. Who is the best left-wing anarchist YouTuber?
Thought bad.
Are you sure? That says something like Anarcho-Pack or Non-Compete. Have another go.
Thought bad.
Well, fair enough then. I suppose you are the king of breadtube after all.